President Vladimir Putin sends Russian troops to two rebel-held areas in Ukraine in a major escalation of the crisis. In case you haven't noticed today's date, it's a pretty special one, especially for these couples. And fighting back against scammers, how one victim is helping to save others from getting conned. Good evening, you're watching The Big Story with me, Hairianto Diman. Subscribe to the Straits Times channel so you will not miss a single episode. We begin with the latest developments in the Ukraine crisis after Russian President Vladimir Putin recognized two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine as independent. He also ordered Russian troops to deploy on what he called a peacekeeping operation. The self-declared People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk are home to Russian-backed rebels who have been fighting Ukrainian forces since 2014. Shortly after Mr. Putin's speech, military vehicles were spotted on the outskirts of Donetsk, according to a Reuters witness. No insignia was visible. It was not immediately clear whether this marked the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Earlier, in a signing ceremony shown on state television, Mr. Putin described Ukraine as an integral part of Russia's history, and he said he was confident that Russia's citizens supported the decision.
Ситуация на Донбассе вновь приобрела критический острый характер. И сегодня обращаюсь к вам напрямую, чтобы не только дать оценку происходящему, но и проинформировать вас о принимаемых решениях, о возможных дальнейших шагах на этом направлении. Еще раз подчеркну, что Украина для нас это не просто соседняя страна. Это неотъемлемая часть нашей собственной истории, культуры, духовного пространства.
Global Affairs correspondent Jonathan Eyal joins me now from London. Jonathan, in a televised speech following the move to recognize two breakaway regions in Ukraine, Mr. Putin said Ukraine has no history of being a true nation. What happens now? Does Mr. Putin's speech signal that a larger-scale invasion is the next step?
Well, we will have to wait and see. One of the biggest questions in Europe today is whether the move into the enclaves, the military move into the enclaves by Russia's armed forces is the peak of the crisis or merely the beginning of the crisis. And let us not forget that there is a few unresolved questions about it. First of all, whether the Russian president respects the current borders of the enclaves, because the borders of the enclaves itself within Ukraine are being disputed, and it is quite possible that Russian forces would actually go beyond the enclaves. But secondly, of course, the biggest question is what is the purpose of this exercise? After all, Mr. Putin, as you said, denies the very existence of the Ukrainian nation and claims that Ukraine is an artificial state which should be merged into Russia. If that is the logic, then what we've seen over the last 24 hours is merely the beginning of the fighting, which will continue later. So it's quite possible that Mr. Putin is just trying to provoke Ukraine into responding, which will provide him with a justification for moving to an all-out invasion. This is why the move is exceptionally grave at the moment.
So, that said, how is Ukraine readying itself for a possible war? What is the leadership doing?
Well, effectively, they're doing two things. First of all, they're trying to mobilize all the armed forces of Ukraine and train the civilian population for what effectively would be guerrilla warfare. The comparisons between the two countries just don't stand up. There's no way Ukraine, despite being one of Europe's largest states, can stand up to Russia and the Russian military. So all that the Ukrainians can do is to persuade the Russians, to deter the Russians by telling them that the invasion will be costly. But I think a much more important element for the leadership of Ukraine is to remain in step with other Western governments, to keep the coalition of Western governments that is supporting Ukraine at the moment, not to fall in for the trap that the Russians are very often laying, the provocations that are there just in order to justify the beginning of a war. It's getting increasingly difficult for President Zelensky of Ukraine to go along with that kind of calm policy when you have a neighbor that keeps on biting a territory off your own lands. So this is going to be the long game, and the Ukrainians know that they're in the long game. As President Zelensky keeps on saying, they've been at it for 8 years in one shape or another. It is us in Western Europe who are now suddenly paying more attention to their plight.
Let's talk about the other European countries, France and Germany spearheading diplomacy talks. Jonathan, is there still hope for a breakthrough there? Can war be averted?
Well, I think it's very, very unlikely that diplomacy has much of a chance. Let us not forget that a lot of the diplomatic initiative was based on the precisely discussions between the Russians and the Ukrainians over the future of the enclaves. Now, President Putin of Russia has now removed that question from the table by recognizing these republics as independent. So the entire diplomatic framework that existed and was put in place is no longer available. But just important, that's really worth remembering, is that Putin's moves have taken place just in a few days before the Russian and American foreign ministers were due to meet in Geneva in Switzerland. And just as there was a discussion about the summit between President Biden of the United States and the Russian president. So the indications are that the Russian leadership is not particularly interested in spending time in diplomatic negotiations and believes it can achieve much more with boots on the ground.
Jonathan, thank you for your inputs. Jonathan Eyal there, Global Affairs Correspondent for the Straits Times. More reactions to the Ukraine crisis in response to Moscow recognizing the two rebel regions in Ukraine. The White House says that the US will announce new sanctions against Russia, which it will coordinate with its allies and partners later today. President Joe Biden earlier signed an executive order to prohibit trade and investment between US individuals and the two breakaway regions. Included is the prohibition of a new investment by an American wherever located and the importation into the United States directly or indirectly of any goods, services or technology from the covered regions. Meanwhile, at the emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, China's ambassador to the UN called all parties concerned in the Ukraine crisis to exercise restraint and avoid any action that might fuel tensions, adding that Beijing welcomed and encouraged every effort for a diplomatic solution to the crisis. Let's put this all in perspective. Our US Bureau Chief Nirmal Ghosh is here and he's in Singapore at the moment. Nirmal, where does China stand on the Ukraine crisis? We saw a new closeness between Presidents Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping just weeks ago at the Beijing's Winter Olympics.
Yes, we saw that. And by the way, there is a school of thought in the United States, mostly in conservative policy circles, that the US must not allow the relationship with Russia to become so adversarial because Russia and the US should be on the same side eventually against China. But be that as it may, China has been saying Europe and the United States must acknowledge Vladimir Putin's point of view. But more recently, in video remarks at the 58th Munich Security Conference, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi said Ukraine should serve as a communication bridge between the East and West instead of a frontier for contestation. He said countries should reject the idea of exclusive or absolute security and guard against a new Cold War. He did say that Russia's reasonable security concerns should be respected. And on Monday, at an emergency UN Security Council meeting, China's ambassador said all parties concerned must exercise restraint and avoid any action that may fuel tensions. He said, we welcome and encourage every effort for a diplomatic solution. So in essence, it seems that China has settled on a strategy to oppose a Russian invasion of Ukraine on principle, while continuing to blame the United States and its allies for hyping the threat from Russia and for misunderstanding Vladimir Putin's security concerns. This serves its interest, which is not to align too closely with Russia and draw even more hostility from US-led Western powers, while maintaining the principle of opposing any country's interference in another country's internal affairs.
Nirmal, tensions have been escalating between Russia and Ukraine for some time now. What is Mr. Putin's strategy, you think, and why might Russia invade Ukraine?
Yes, well, now in reality, he has bitten off a chunk of eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, where Russia has had assets inside for a long time. So that is really not that new, but it is a forward consolidation, and it does raise the threat to the rest of Ukraine. This problem has a long history. Its roots go back to the disintegration of the old Soviet Union and the eastward expansion of NATO. In the north, for example, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, the Baltic states, were once part of the Soviet Union, but since 2004 have been members of NATO and the European Union. And in 2008, NATO welcomed what it called the aspiration of Ukraine to join that alliance. But that is a clear red line for Moscow, because if Ukraine joins NATO, that would bring NATO forces and NATO missiles right up to Russia's border with Ukraine. It would be a bit like Russia putting missiles in Cuba. Of course, NATO is a defensive alliance, but that does not cut much ice in Moscow if the alliance continues to creep up to Russia's borders, leaving no buffers. That is Russia's point of view. Now, Vladimir Putin wants a commitment that Ukraine will never become a part of NATO, but Ukraine's current regime does not want to give such a commitment, neither does the US and its NATO allies. And Vladimir Putin is using all this specifically that 2008 Bucharest statement as an excuse and an opportunity to enforce his red line. Russia sees a neutral or pro-Russia Ukraine as a core security issue. It sees a pro-West Ukraine as a security threat. And as we know, as you said, this has been going on for a long time. Ukraine is contested, and Vladimir Putin may see this as an opportunity to make a decisive move and finish this problem once and for all. Or he may stop at taking this chunk of Ukraine to show that he is serious and not go ahead with a full-scale invasion. Now, this has become a contest, a relapse of the Cold War proxy contest between Russia and the United States. It is possible that Putin will not invade the rest of Ukraine, and that would allow him to keep this chunk of territory, to extend his security sphere, perimeter, so to speak, and also not incur the wider sanctions threatened by the US and its European allies. In Washington, those sanctions are still being threatened if he invades the rest of Ukraine. The US does not consider sending Russian forces into these two eastern areas as an invasion of the entire country, again, because Russia has had assets in there for a while already.
Nirmal, thank you for your perspectives. US Bureau Chief Nirmal Ghosh. Singapore's Foreign Ministry has issued a statement on the latest developments, saying all parties involved in the Ukraine crisis must pursue dialogue to reach a peaceful settlement and avoid any action that would further raise tensions. The statement adds that Singapore is gravely concerned at the escalation of tensions at the Ukraine-Russia border and the Russian decision to recognize two breakaway Ukrainian regions. The sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine must be respected. On the local front, Manpower Minister Tan See Leng says that all employers should not request MCs from COVID-positive workers, as the front end of the health system, like polyclinics, GP clinics and hospital emergency departments, are still feeling the stresses brought about by the Omicron wave.
The GPs and the EDs report that the great majority of patients who go to them have either no symptoms or mild symptoms. And doctors have also shared that many patients have been visiting them for the sole purpose of obtaining medical certificates or MCs, just so that they can submit to their workplaces. I want to reiterate, these visits are not necessary, and they risk compromising the standard of care for other patients who genuinely require medical care. All HR professionals and employees should not request for MCs from employees who tested COVID positive. They should familiarize themselves with the COVID-19 health protocols and excuse employees from returning to the workplaces for the periods required. They should also not require for a recovery memo or medical assessment from a doctor before allowing employees to return to workplaces after the required isolation periods.
Of the over 11,000 students who sat the A-level exams last year, 93.5% passed, just 0.1% shy of last year's mark and comparable to previous years, notwithstanding COVID-19. A student tells the Straits Times how being sick with COVID-19 affected her exam preparations, but good news, she did well enough to get into university.
Initially, I just hoped to be able to get to a uni, but after I got my result, I think I did much better than I expected. And honestly, at the moment, I just felt very relieved. Initially, when I found out I got COVID, everyone was scared. It was like a panic. But then, I think beyond that, as time went on, my teacher will call us daily over Zoom, and then we have like discussions within the class. And then I think with the support of my friends, who will constantly buy me Grab food or call individually or watch movies together or to study together, right? I think that really helped me through the COVID period.
February 22nd, 2022, a special palindromic date that comes once in a lifetime, and it's especially significant for more than 500 couples here who chose today to exchange their marital vows. Besides signifying twosome, the date is also regarded by many Chinese as favorable for success since it contains all even numbers.
Today is 22nd of February, year 2022, so it's a very special day. I think it was very easy to remember. That's why we chose it.
We were looking at dates, and then we missed some good dates as well. 2-1, 1-2, 2021. So,
but now it's even better.
Yeah.
Everything is in twos.
Right.
Even today is Tuesday. We heard that there are almost 500 couples in matrimony today. It feels great. I think it's very special to share with so many other different couples, and I think it's a special day for everybody.
Actually, we were quite surprised there are 500 couples until the article came out that we are one of the 500. Went there early and we managed to get a very nice queue number, 18. So, and we just got our cert within 15 minutes. We did have some argument on the team, right? But I think eventually we both agreed that, okay, if it's Mario and it's something that's my favorite, and she chose to be the peach, which is the princess, she compromised it. So, so we decided to have Mario at our team. I think it's a date that is the easiest to remember. And I mean, I will not forget my anniversary for sure.
We've been hearing a lot about scams lately, victims losing tens of thousands of dollars to fraudsters, and how there seems to be no way of getting their money back. But in today's Invest segment, we have a story with a twist. A Singaporean fraud victim turning the tables on scammers after losing $80,000. How exactly did she do it? Well, let's find out. Invest editor Tan Wee Boon is with us. Welcome to the show again, Wee Boon. We're going to talk about scam victims again. But this time round, it's a bit different because she managed to beat the fraudsters at their own game. How did she do it?
You know something? I would actually love to invite her to come to the SD studio to tell her story personally, but we need to protect her identity because she's doing a lot of good work that will put many scammers out of work. She is a 34-year-old Singaporean who used to work as an online content editor. And yes, she was a former scam victim who was cheated of $80,000. But instead of wallowing in depression, she actually turned her agony into strength. In just 8 days, she used her talent to create a website that we all know now as the Global Anti-Scam Organization, or GASO for short. As a victim herself, she knows how to counsel people and warn them of potential scams. And thanks to her, she has gathered a band of about 60 former victims. And together, this group has been doing great work around the world in warning people about scams. To date, they have intervened and saved over 5,000 people from falling into scams and also save them from losing millions of dollars. Imagine our Singapore girl is making such an impact worldwide. No wonder someone commented on the SD Facebook that she should be nominated for the Singaporean of the Year award.
And on that, Wibun, what advice does she have so that others don't fall victim?
Well, she and I both share these sentiments when it comes to money, and that is never give money to anyone you meet online. No matter how compelling their stories are, you should never give money to anyone who you have not met face to face. Even video calls are not good enough because Gasso believes that some syndicates have been using technology to create images of real people talking as fronts to deceive their victims. So you could be talking to an avatar. So what this means is that if any of your online friends start to talk to you about investing, it's probably a sign that you're being targeted. As a general rule, you should be careful when it comes to investment. Avoid putting money into any unknown company. Always do your own research and deal only with companies you are comfortable with, not entities that are introduced to you by strangers. It goes without saying that if they tell you that your investment will make a lot of money, it is probably true because your life savings will become their profit.
Great advice there, Wibun Invest editor Tan Wibun. The Straits Times has launched a Stop Scams campaign to create awareness and alert people to how they can protect themselves. You'll find stories and videos at str.sg/stopscams. And those are our top stories for today. For more news, visit straitstimes.com and our YouTube channel for more videos. Remember to subscribe by hitting the red button below. I'm Haryanto Diman. See you tomorrow for more stories on The Big Story.